is from NPR. These disabled people tried to play by the rules. It cost them their federal benefits. The thing that got Karen Williams into trouble was that she tried to do the responsible thing and bought a life insurance policy that would pay for her funeral. The Philadelphia woman had seen family members scramble to find money, begging friends or starting GoFundMe campaigns to pay the high cost of burying a loved one. Williams didn't want to burden her children. She had no idea that buying the insurance would get her caught up in an antiquated federal rule as an asset limit that snares more than 100,000 of America's poorest disabled and elderly every year, often with dire consequences. Williams, who is disabled and doesn't work, relied upon a little-known federal assistance program, Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, run by the Social Security Administration. It sends monthly benefit checks. The average amount is $700 to 7.4 million of the nation's neediest disabled and elderly to help them pay for rent, food, medicine, and other everyday needs. The program started 51 years ago, but updated little since then. Is hampered by out-of-date rules such as the limit of assets. Williams, 63, thought her life insurance wouldn't be used until after she died. She didn't understand it had a cash value, and she could turn it in and collect $1,900. That was far less than the $10,000 in funeral expenses she bought the policy to cover when she died. For Williams, the cash value of her policy, along with the $260 she had saved in her checking account, pushed her over SSI's $2,000 limit on how much a recipient is allowed in savings and other assets. That $2,000 asset limit hasn't changed since 1989. If it had kept up over the 51 years with inflation, it would be $10,000 today. I would have definitely went by the rules, Williams said. I didn't know I was breaking them. The penalty was stiff. Williams was kicked off of SSI, her primary source of income, and told by Social Security to pay back 2 years of benefits totaling $20,000. She had 30 days to pay it back. The impact of it is just cruel, says Kathleen Romig. Romig recently went to work as a senior advisor to the Commission of Social Security. She works on making programs like SSI fairer to children. When NPR interviewed her last year, she wasn't speaking for Social Security or SSI. She worked at a Washington think tank, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, as the director of Social Security and Disability Policy, where she wrote about raising SSI's asset limit or ending it altogether. SSI is stuck in the past, Romig said. It's hardly been changed over 50 years. An NPR investigation finds SSI is deeply in need of modernization. It was intended to lift people out of poverty when it was created in 1972 and started paying benefits for the first time in 1974. Instead, because of the asset limit and other rigid and rusty rules, SSI has become a forgotten safety net that keeps many of its recipients stuck in poverty. NPR interviewed roughly about 200 people, including those who depend on SSI, lawyers who get them, experts who study SSI and poverty, Social Security officials, staff, and others. Among our findings, SSI's asset limit and other rules are so out of date that many of the poorest Americans who need SSI the most are excluded from the program, largely because of the asset limit. SSI sends out benefit checks to impoverished beneficiaries, but then often months or years later tells them there's been a mistake and they need to pay back the money, which it calls overpayments. SSI's asset limit and other rules impose a substantial marriage penalty on recipients, forcing many to skip marriage or lose benefits when they do marry. For many, the marriage penalty comes with even more calamitous results than losing a monthly benefit check. Many beneficiaries depend on the Medicaid eligibility that is automatic in most states for someone who qualifies for SSI, but then risk losing Medicaid if they marry. Social Security is not set up to the task of administering such a complex system. After years of budget constraints imposed by Congress, it is understaffed and hurt by an antiquated computer system and the extreme administrative burden of calculating the asset limit of other SSI rules. In Philadelphia, Karen Williams was caught off guard when in 2019 she got a letter from Social Security telling she needed to come to the local office. That's where Williams was told she was over the $2,000 limit on assets, and she had been for a long time. Someone at Social Security had noticed she'd accumulated $260 in her checking account, and she had spotted her life insurance policy with this $1,900 cash value. Social Security staff knew about the policy because when Williams told them about it, when someone gets approved for SSI, they give Social Security the right to check their bank accounts and monitor other records of assets. She had purchased the policy before she went into SSI and used her SSI benefits to pay the premium, according to Williams and her attorneys. At the Social Security office, Williams was told she'd been over the asset limit for the previous 2 years. As a result, she was issued an overpayment notice to pay back all the benefit checks she received in that time. She owed $20,000 and she had 30 days to pay it back. That was impossible. Williams was impoverished. She was disabled and didn't work. That's why she qualified for SSI. You're telling me I owe you $20,000, Williams remembered thinking. Oh, Social Security office. I can't even pay my bills. Where am I going to live? Social Security allows a few exceptions to what gets counted as an asset. A recipient and their immediate family living with them can own one car and a home. There are ways to put money into trusts or get waivers, but that's tricky and often requires hiring a lawyer. There's an exception for burial insurance, but insurance for funerals often gets sold as life insurance, like the policy Williams bought. Williams said Social Security workers gave her a contradictory and even wrong advice about how she could resolve the issue with the policy to cover funeral expenses. Ultimately, she sought out the help of Gregory Burrell, president and CEO of the Terry Funeral Home, an institute in West Philadelphia that has served black families for generations. Burrell let Williams turn the policy over to the funeral home. We see that in that time, Burrell, a former president of the National Funeral Directors and Morticians Association, the largest group of black funeral directors, said of the conclusion that caught Williams, unfortunately, people don't know any better, and they're stressing, and these insurance policies, they're considered assets. Burrell and Williams talked about how their own parents and grandparents purchased burial insurance, putting aside small amounts, sometimes just 50 cents a month, to hand the agent who regularly knocked on their door and initialed their savings book to note the payment. It was one of the few kinds of insurance black families could buy, and both Burrell and Williams say seeing their parents and grandparents saving taught them the importance of financial responsibility. It was deeply embarrassing for Williams when she lost her SSI checks. It was the middle of the pandemic. She got by with them from her She got by with the help from her children and friends. She says the stress of losing her SSI check, her primary source of income, led to health problems, including 2 hospitalizations for heart attacks. Williams found a lawyer at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia who helped her challenge the big bill she got for SSI. Last year, Social Security conceded it made a mistake and had not properly told Williams of her right to appeal. Her lawyers asked for and won the agency's agreement to waive the $20,000 overpayment, but then her lawyers said the agency ignored its own decision and reissued the overpayment charge. The attorneys appealed again, and the order to pay is now on hold. In addition, her lawyers were able to move Williams to a different Social Security retirement program, one without an asset limit, and she started receiving benefits again. But Williams still feels stressed over not knowing whether she will be expected to repay that money she doesn't have. If this sounds confusing, it is, and her case shows that SSI's asset limit and her rules are so complex that not even Social Security staff can always get things right. Recipients usually need to find an attorney to help them negotiate the process, but the attorneys are hard for poor people to afford or find. Also, few lawyers take SSI cases because Social Security puts a low cap on how much they can earn from such cases. It's really tiresome. I am so through with this, Williams said, and I believe that a lot of people just give up. On average, 70,000 beneficiaries have had their benefits suspended every year, according to Romick, the policy expert now at the Social Security Administration, and 40,000 have had their benefits terminated. The low asset limit, Romick said, penalizes people when they try to save. We know that saving is good, she said. We know that we can use savings to invest in things that can make people's lives better. For example, education or safe and stable housing. We know that saving is necessary for that, and yet we're prohibiting some of the poorest, most vulnerable people from doing just that. Jennifer Burdick, an attorney at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, says the low asset limit traps people in poverty. You need to be poor and stay poor in order to get these benefits, she said. It's a disincentive against saving and being responsible in this way. It's a disgrace. Burdick once represented a family that needed to fix the roof that collapsed on their house and took a small loan from a friend. Social Security counted the loan as an asset and cut off the benefits that went to the family's disabled son. NPR heard dozens of similar stories from SSI recipients and their lawyers of people desperately in need of the government's benefits who got kicked off or couldn't get on because they couldn't stay under the low asset limit. Peter Belletti of Deer Park, New York, fought Social Security for years after he was denied SSI benefits because he owns a timeshare in the Poconos, one that he argued is worthless. He tried to sell it without success and showed proof to Social Security. One obstacle to selling it, he owns it with his ex-wife. The best he can offer a buyer is 3.5 days of the week. The best he can offer a buyer is 3.5 days of the week she uses it. but he said Social Security staff in Long Island insisted that he needs to sell it. That's why I was told by my caseworker there, Valerity said, because you still have the timeshare, you're ineligible, period. Have a nice day. An Illinois man who asked to be anonymous for fear of retaliation told he feels trapped living in his unsafe and run-down apartment because he saved up for the down payment for on a new place. Social Security said he was over the asset limit and moved to end his SSI. A Holocaust survivor in Virginia received a reparations check from Germany last year, and when Social Security spotted the extra money in his bank account, it moved to end his SSI. Holocaust reparations are excluded from calculating federal benefits, but it took the intervention of an attorney to sort it out. In Georgia, Stacey Ramirez says Social Security suddenly stopped sending SSI checks to her 29-year-old autistic son Ryan last year. The agency, in a letter, said its review found $1,400 in two bank accounts. But Ramirez says Social Security got it wrong, and there were no accounts in her son's name or Social Security number at those banks, something she says the banks confirmed to her. Still, Social Security demanded that her son repay 3 months of SSI checks, a total of $3,000. Then Ramirez says, just as mysteriously and without notice, Ryan was put back on SSI and sent 3 checks for exactly $3,000, but Social Security still demanded a repayment of $3,000. Ramirez says her son was able to stay in his apartment only because his family had money to pay his rent when his income was cut off. One irony, Ramirez and her husband, Dan Crimmins, are professional disability consultants who help families apply for SSI benefits. Social Security eventually relented after Ramirez documented months of research and calls to multiple agency staffers. The system is so broken, says Ramirez, it can't support itself, much less the people who desperately need the support. SSI's origins go back to Richard Nixon. In 1969, the Republican president proposed replacing the existing federal welfare system with a guaranteed basic income of monthly vouchers to impoverished Americans. Nixon's plan faced opposition from many conservatives and liberals, and after 3 years of revisions, failed to get through Congress. But one part of Nixon's plan survived and became supplemental security income and monthly benefits to disabled, blind, and elderly people. These were considered the deserving poor. SSI was an early version of that. In the last few years, has become an increasingly popular strategy for fighting poverty to provide impoverished people with a guaranteed monthly income. There are now 150 of these guaranteed income experiments, sponsored mostly by philanthropists and sometimes by the state or local government, that have spread across the country in just the last few years. SSI is the OG guaranteed income plan, says Rebecca Velez of the nonpartisan National Academy of Social Insurance, using slang for original gangster to refer to SSI as the original guaranteed income program. The new experiments show where SSI, with many of its strings attached, went wrong, she says, with all of its dehumanizing and hyper-restrictive eligibility criteria. For most people, those monthly SSI checks provide a survival income, Velez says. This is money that people spend on rent. This is money that people spend on food, on co-pays, on their medications, on the kinds of basic needs, on their kids' basic needs. That's where the money goes. Today, 7.4 million people receive those monthly SSI benefits. Only 43% of those who apply get accepted for SSI, and Social Security Administration offices determines whether an applicant meets the asset limit. A state disability determination service officer determines whether the person's disability is significant enough to limit work and other basic life activities. The wait times to get approved for disability benefits are long, almost doubling during the pandemic when Social Security closed its offices. One congressional report found that some 10,000 people die every year while they wait to get on SSI or a disability program for people with work history. Of those who collect SSI benefits, 84% are eligible because of a significant disability. There are 1 million children who receive SSI benefits. A U.S. Supreme Court ruling in 1990 expanded eligibility for children. Policy changes in 1984 expanded eligibility for people with mental illness. In addition, a little more than 2 million impoverished people 65 or older get SSI. As SSI expanded to include more children and people with mental illness, critics worried that the program was growing too quickly and encouraged people to depend upon federal welfare. SSI's rolls peaked a decade ago and then fell after Congress and Social Security tightened eligibility reviews and kept the low asset limit in place. Jack Smulligan, a senior policy fellow at the Urban Institute, says SSI serves the poorest of the poor. More than half have no other income. As a result, he says, those who get SSI gain a lot. Sometimes it lifts families out of poverty. They also have a lot to lose if they get kicked off. Smulligan's research colleague Chantel Bowens says that of the poorest Americans, SSI can be more critical than other governmental assistance programs. Those may pay for food or energy bills, but SSI is your monthly income, she says. It's what you live on. If I lose it, do I have a roof over my head for my kids? The stakes for SSI are very high. One absurdity of SSI's asset limits, says Boyens, is that people lose SSI benefits when they're below the poverty line. A disproportionate number of recipients are African American and Latino. Among work-age recipients of SSI, 32.8% are Black. For children, 36.8% are Black, and 26.2% are Latino. People of color on SSI are even more poor than white recipients. SSI, a $61 billion program in 2023, is funded out of the general tax revenues. It is not funded by the trust funds that support better-known parts of Social Security, like the checks it sends 53 million retirees and their dependents, or Social Security Disability Insurance, which supports 8.5 million people who leave the workforce because of a disability. Unlike SSI's frozen rules, the amount of the monthly benefit checks does change from year to year to reflect inflation. In 2024, the maximum monthly benefit is $1,000 for an individual and $1,500 for a couple. The average benefit for an individual is $700. Most states and the District of Columbia add a small supplement, an average of $145 in 2022 to disabled or older persons as a check. When SSI was created, Congress said its purpose was to provide a positive assurance that the nation's aged, blind, and disabled people would no longer have to subsist on below poverty level incomes. But today, the maximum SSI check takes recipients to just 75% of the poverty line. The asset limit was controversial from the beginning. There seems to be a strong element of punishment associated with these tests, an economist wrote in a review of SSI commissioned by Congress on the program's 10th anniversary. Recipients of SSI, he said, are required to enter in a state of pauperization with all in its negative aspects. This is done as a punishment for having to seek help for the rest of society and as a warning and a hence deterrent to others. Katie Saban, an assistant professor of social work at California State University, Sacramento, says now SSI's stalled asset limit adds to that stigma. People must limit their own opportunities for work and marriage, submit to continuous surveillance of their finances, health, and personal affairs, and survive on poverty-level income without ever having more than $2,000 in assets, Saban says. Last year, Gabriela Guerrero of St. Louis passed the bar. She opened her own law firm, but quickly had to stop taking clients. I really had to limit what I was doing and haven't taken on any new cases because I'm really afraid, she says. She's afraid of something that other lawyers don't have to worry about, that she'll make too much money, which in her case means just $2,000, the SSI limit. Guerrero was born with spinal muscular atrophy, a condition that causes weakened muscles. Nurses come to Guerrero's home 12 hours every day. Personal care assistants are scheduled, when she can find them, several hours more. I'm not able to do any of my own care, so brushing my teeth, washing my face, give me a shower, she says. Just all the basics that you physically do for yourself. Most importantly, she requires nurses and aides to run and monitor the technology that keeps her healthy and out of the hospital or a nursing home. There's her feeding tube and the ventilator that keeps her breathing at night. She needs a nurse to operate the machine that suctions her lungs several times a day. Without that assistance, I would just be dead, says Guerrero. There's not really another way I would function, but it's all tied to SSI. In most states, someone who is eligible for SSI is automatically qualified for Medicaid, the state and federal health insurance for people with little income. It's Medicaid that pays for Guerrero's nurses and aides. Private insurance, the kind that people get through work, typically won't cover in-home personal care assistants and nurses. Guerrero's only other option would be to make enough money to pay for her aides and nurses out of her own pocket. But the cost for that level of assistance she gets, Guerrero calculates, would run between $100,000 and $200,000 a year, and she doubts that she could make that much. So to keep her SSI and the Medicaid that's tied to it, Guerrero is required to stay under the $2,000 asset limit. Guerrero is 33. She was born 6 months after President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disability Act law in 1990, proclaiming, "Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down." When SSI was created in 1972, they were very different and much lower expectation for the lives of disabled people. SSI, for example, predates the law passed in 1975 that first gave disabled people the right to go to school and get an education. Before then, more than 1 million disabled children were excluded from schools. SSI came years before the ADA, which banned discrimination at work, on public transportation, or access to public places like to restaurants and movie theaters. We've made a lot of progress over the last 50 years as disabled people, Gabriel says. We went from being mostly institutionalized, not going to school, not going to public places. But there's still one basic right that Gabriel misses, solely because she needs SSI. She can't marry without substantial risk. It is difficult for someone who gets an SSI check to marry and stay under the asset limit because a spouse's income isn't counted. Where a single person on SSI is allowed up to $2,000 in assets, the limit for a couple is only $3,000. That's another limit that hasn't budged since 1989. Both asset limits for individual and couples were raised by Congress in 1984 from $1,500 for an individual and $2,250 for a couple, but the new levels didn't take effect until 1989. NPR interviewed dozens of people who said their only options were to marry and lose SSI, marry and then lie about the relationship, or to close themselves off from romantic relationships altogether. Gabriel has been involved with her partner, Juan Johnson, for several years, but they can't make plans to marry. She'd like that commitment, plus she grew up in a religious family where marriage was important. Several years ago, Gabriel says her caseworker at Social Security asked if we were sharing a bedroom. Gabriel ducked the question. My heart was pounding when she asked that because I didn't know if I was about to get in trouble. The caseworker dropped the issue, but Gabriel says she realized the government worker had all the power over my life that she could ever want. Under Social Security's rules, a couple doesn't need to be legally married for a disabled person to lose SSI. Just living as if they were married, called holding out, is enough to get counted as a couple under the $3,000 asset limit. One woman, who asked to stay anonymous, told NPR she married but then divorced her husband to stay on SSI. Currently, the man doesn't work and does a lot of her caregiving. They still spend most of the time together, but they keep separate apartments. When the woman's state caseworker comes for a visit, she says she takes down all the photographs of her and her apartment, of her and her partner. Wow, what the fuck? What the fuck? Social Security said it could not provide data of how many people lose SSI for violating the hold out rule or for marrying. NPR could not find recent examples of people who lost their SSI for living as a couple, but found dozens of disabled people who hide their relationships or say they avoid them altogether. Nobody should be afraid to say they're in a relationship with somebody, says Guevara, comparing the situation to the fight for the legalization of interracial marriage in 1967 and the marriage for same-sex couples in 2015. In law school, Guevara wrote a law review article about SSI's so-called marriage penalty. The choice disabled people must make is always simple. It is a choice between marital happiness and medical necessity, she concluded. The American dream is supposed to be open to everyone, regardless of status, and achieving it includes having a fully formed family to come home to at the end of the day. I'm mentally disabled, so I get it. I'm fighting disability right now.